Many thanks, Jose, and I think that's a brilliant introduction and a hard act to follow, Tom. I think we've got a tough act to follow. But,
exactly. But we're good friends. So
but we're good friends. So I have a few questions for Tom. I do want to thank the law school, the NYU Law School, and the Center for Human Rights and Global Justice for being a partner with ICTJ on this event now for a number of years. We've had very good events, and again tonight. I would like to also really am delighted that Representative Mignone family is here tonight, and so that means a lot to us. And we have a very distinguished audience here with a lot of important people and those who've contributed to the cause of international justice and transitional justice. I did want to recognize my predecessor and the President Emeritus of ICTJ, Juan Mendez, who's sitting in the front row. I'm very honored to have Juan here with us tonight, so it's very good to see you, Juan. Tom, I mean, I think I will also, I'm holding up, I think, a slightly different edition than Jose of the A Lucky Child, but I thought we would start there because before we move into your very illustrious international career, because it is such, as Jose has said, it's such a remarkable book, from the Kielce ghetto to Auschwitz, from the death march in Auschwitz to the next step in the line, which is also another concentration camp, and your survival. And of course, I've known you for a long time and know you well, and I was rereading the book for maybe the third time the other night in preparation, and I was saying, how is Tom going to get around this one every 3 or 4 pages? How is he going to survive? And it's a great tale of a great story of survival in the face of, in the most extraordinary of situations. And the triumph of the human spirit that you show as a child here, and making your way through a very, very difficult set of circumstances, and then being separated from your parents, losing your father, and then the incredible story of reuniting with your mother some years later. So it's a very inspiring and moving story. But one of the things that you and I've talked about before is you didn't write this book sort of immediately after the fact. This came along about 6 decades later, more or less, right? And we in a previous conversation, you said to me that this is a very different book that you wrote all these years later than what you would have written immediately after your time in Auschwitz and so forth, or 5 years later, or in that kind of aftermath period. And I'm wondering if you might talk a little bit about why you say that. What's the difference? What's the difference in perspective? And what are the origins of that difference?
Yes. First of all, let me say, this is a room that I've known as a student. And it's nice to be back and to be here rather than there. And a university, a law school that I'm most grateful for, a scholarship which I had, which enabled me to study here. So I'm delighted to be back at this law school. I must say, the room hasn't changed somehow. And looking at the chairs, they seem to be very worn. I don't think anything has happened since my day. But back to the book. And Jose, many thanks for your kind words. You know, I didn't realize when you asked me, you know, how would it have been different? Mm-hmm. I remember I was asked once in the Holocaust Museum to talk about the death march out of Auschwitz, which was a terrible period. So many people died along the road. And as I started to write my talk, I suddenly realized that I no longer felt the cold, the terrible cold in January of 1945, Polish weather, the hunger, And when I started to write, I was writing as if I was talking about somebody else. Whereas if I had written it right afterward, not only would I have felt the cold, but I would also have felt the tremendous hatred. So I really needed the perspective of many, many years, I think 50, some almost 60 years later, that I wrote the book. And I think the book really represents more the type of experience that I feel made me who I am. And if it had written it 5 years later, it would have been the wrong sort of book. It wouldn't have been me that I am today. So I'm delighted I waited. Of course, as I was writing it, I kept continuously saying, I wish my mother were here, because there are so many questions that I would have liked to answer. And I think all of us have the same thing with our parents. But as I was writing the book, I often sort of said, did this really happen? Or am I imagining that it happened? And then I said, I would have liked to ask my mother, whom I always called Mutti, did this really happen, or did you talk about it? So it's not the book I would have written, but I think in many ways it's a more important book.
There are a lot of moving scenes in the book, Tom, and I can think of dozens, but the one that struck me the deepest, I think you were in the work camp, and some of the detainees tried to flee, and they were captured, and they were brought back, and they were forced to build gallows, and they then were marched to the gallows, and other prisoners were being forced to put the noose around the neck of these escapees. And one of them, with very trembling hands, wasn't able to do that, for whether out of fear or for moral reasons. And the prisoner who was being ready to be hanged turned and kissed the hand of this fellow prisoner, and actually stuck his neck through the noose. And I think you talked about it in the book as a great act of moral resistance, which takes the same courage as physical, takes the same courage as physical resistance, and is a very moving kind of moving scene. And I just wondered if you had wanted to just reflect on that. It's interesting. One of the reviews of the book, I'm sure you've read all of the reviews, of course. I checked a few out. And
like we read footnotes to check our names.
Exactly. But I think it was Publishers Weekly said something along the lines, if I remember correctly, that your career in human rights was probably very affected by that kind of scene, and scenes and also in Auschwitz and so forth, and this idea of moral resistance. And I'm interested in your reaction to that, and how those kind of scenes and those acts of courage and resistance affected you ultimately as a human rights lawyer and a career in international justice.
Yes, I think I was always surprised, especially when I came to the United States, when there was tremendous criticism of the failure of Jews, us, to resist. And it usually came from people who had no idea what it was like in those camps. But to me, it always seemed that the sort of moral resistance that was shown in the moral courage that was shown was so much more important, and it said so much more about our people than, say, the Warsaw Ghetto. It was easy to fight and die because you knew you were going to die anyway. But the things that people did when the mother who would go instead of the child, the friend, the old man, those are the things that say something about the people who were in the camps, and most of them who died. So I think we really haven't paid too much attention to really those type of things that happened in the camp. Hundreds of those things resistance. A small example that I always cite, and it's really nothing, is my father never wore a hat in the camp. And particularly because whenever you wore a hat in this terrible weather in Poland, when any German came by, you had to take it off. And he said, I'm just going to do it. I'm not going to greet him. He doesn't deserve it. Mm. So they used to call him a Meshuggner because in the winter, he wouldn't wear a hat. But it's a small little thing, but it showed, and there were hundreds much more serious things than this. I was very much influenced by that sort of courage, by the honesty, that when people didn't steal bread from somebody else or gave somebody a piece of bread when the piece of bread meant living or dying. That influenced me probably more than any sort of resistance when you knew you were going to be shot one way or the other.
So is this Publishers Weekly right, and they trace your kind of commitment to human rights back to those kind of issues of moral resistance, or is it a more complicated process? I
think it's much more complicated. Yeah. When I ask myself, why did I go into this? It's never quite as heroic as it sounds.
Yeah. Well, I did also, this book, A Lucky Child, is not the only book about your time in Auschwitz and so forth, and the camps. There's another book that I can't get my hands on because it's I could get my hands on it, but it's in Norwegian, and I'm not too good at Norwegian. And as I understand it, you're the only one who has a copy of this book in English.
American University Library has one.
Has one copy. Well, I didn't get down there to be able to read this, but I was. It's called. So the book's called Tommy, as I was saying, and I'm just wondering if you might tell us a little bit about Odd Nansen. I may be not pronouncing the name correctly, but there's quite a story in the book about that, and since I can't read the book, I'd be interested to hear a little bit about it.
Actually, part of the book is also part of his diary. Right. Odd Nansen, the son of Fridtjof Nansen, the famous North Pole explorer, was in the camp in Sachsenhausen with me. He was there much longer than I. And he kept a diary throughout his imprisonment. And there is a section in the book that he actually takes and puts into the Tommy book.
Right.
But basically, Mr. Nansen, I think I owe him in many ways the first sort of reflection on hatred, because even in the camps he behaved very differently. And what struck me particularly when his book was published after the war, when his diary was published, he gave all of the money from the German edition to German refugees. And I said to him, I can't understand this. Why would you? This was when I was still in Germany at 16 years old. Why would you give them the money from the income of this book? And then we started to discuss what the consequences are of hatred and where it leads to. And do we really want to go the cycle again and again and again? And that was sort of the beginning of my reflection on where does hatred really leads to? What does it produce? Mm-hmm. And the importance of reconciliation. He was a wonderful man. I also owe him my life, because when I was in Sachsenhausen, on the death march, my legs were frozen, my toes, and I lost 2 toes they operated, believe it or not, in Sachsenhausen. But that meant when you went to the infirmary there, you never got out. They had wonderful facilities in the infirmaries. They were there for inspectors to see, and then if you spent 3 weeks there, you were taken away. And when the Norwegians and the Danes were taken out of the camp close to the end of the war, when he left, he bribed one of the people who were wardens to make sure, don't let the kid be sent out of the revier, as it was called. and otherwise I would never have made it out. And then what was so nice, after the war, he'd give me a piece of paper to write him after the war. He was sure we were all going to survive. And of course I lost the piece of paper. And we reunited actually in 1948. I saw him, and that's when he decided to write the second part of...
I think you wrote a letter to him addressed to Odd Jansen, Norway, right? And
he was
somehow or another...
Yes, he's a very famous man. Actually, just maybe I could say a word about him. Fridtjof Nansen, who was was High Commissioner for Human Rights in the League of Nations time. The Nansen passport, some of you may have heard about. He was the one. When Quisling came to power in Norway, Quisling said if Fridtjof Nansen were alive today, he would be number one member of my party. And his son, Odd Nansen, with whom I was in the camp, gave a press conference and said, "My father was not a traitor to Norway nor a hater of Jews." He was immediately arrested, spent 3.5 years first in camps in Norway and then in Sachsenhausen. So he's went through tremendous experiences, but always kept his humanity, helping others throughout the entire period.
Not to talk about him too much, but he did, I think, help establish Unicef as well.
Yes, yes.
So we could say, perhaps, Tom, you were an inspiration for Unicef. Would that be a fair conclusion?
I wish I could claim that.
I thought maybe we'd shift and talk a little bit about your career and.
But you never asked me a question which I always get and always expect to get. You should know that I don't know what questions David is going to ask me, because I always find doesn't do for a good. But the question you always ask me, where does the title come from for my book?
I was going to ask that at the end, Tom.
Oh.
I think
well, keep it to
I think you've stolen my thunder. So where does the title Lucky Child come from? The last time we did this, I did it first. This time I was going to do it last, but just to try to keep you honest. But
I always anticipate David's questions, and then now you have to keep it in the same order at least.
You told me this was my show. So Tom, the title Lucky Child.
Yes.
Where does it come from?
Finally. I always like to tell the story because it tells so much about my mother. In 1939, we were in a town in Poland, in Kielce, waiting to be taken to England. We had visas to go to England, and the British consul was getting ready to get us out of Poland to England. Incidentally, we never made it because the Germans invaded Poland on the day on which we were supposed to leave. So, but my mother, during that time while we were waiting for the visa, was talked into by a girlfriend to go to a fortune teller. And the fortune teller, my mother was very young at the time. I was born when she was only 20 years old. And I was, I think, 5 or 6 years old at the time. Fortune teller looked at her and said, "You're married, you have a child, and your family is going to go through terrible things." Well, in 1939, for a Jewish family in Poland, you didn't need a fortune teller to tell you those things. But then she said, "But you have a son, and your son is ein Glückskind, a lucky child, and he's going to get through it all unscathed." And so after the war, my mother, she always said I didn't believe in this hocus pocus, but the reality is she really believed it. I had to be alive. When everybody said to her, the children his age, nobody survived, and it's not possible, she insisted that I was alive. So the Glückskind always was something, in German that means a lucky child, sustained her through some very difficult time, a search of 2 years after the war before she found me. And that's why I thought this title had to be in the book. And of course, I was also very lucky because despite what I went through, I'm still here to talk about it. That's the title. Did I tell the story the same way? Or
You told it better this time. You're getting better with the answers. Next time we'll make sure it stays at the end. So, but Tom, maybe I thought that we'd shift a little bit over to from a lucky child to some of your later career, particularly as an international judge, as a human rights expert, because you've made great contributions there in these fields. And of course, you were a founding judge on the Inter-American Court of Human Rights and later president. And that court has had an enormous impact in Latin America. And I was, and I think, as I mentioned, the Rodriguez case and the enforced disappearances, some very important precedents that were established, and it has made an enormous difference in the region. And I was wondering if you might give us some reflections and comments on the role of regional human rights courts. We have a strong system, obviously, in Latin America. We have a strong system in Europe. The rest of the world, there are not really strong regional mechanisms on human rights. And also, maybe put it in the context of we also have other international courts that have emerged, the International Criminal Court, the ad hoc tribunals, and so forth. So I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on the importance of those regional courts and the roles that they play, and also the emergence of the field of international criminal justice.
Well, as you know, there are only in existence today 3 international regional human rights courts in Europe, which is sort of held up as the pioneer and has done some unbelievable, some tremendous achievement. The Inter-American, which came next, and the African now, which is still very much in the beginning stage. Where I think we should have regional human rights court is really all over the world. They create a so-called local commitment, more or less, to human rights, and get people used to the idea that there are international tribunals that watch governments. They may be different in different countries, but I think it's critical. For example, we have none in Asia. In Asia, we really would need some tribunals. All of Asia is probably too big for one tribunal. Sub-regional tribunals in Asia would be ideal, but we would need them there. They would create a sort of total different attitude to human rights. Now, Asia in many parts is subject to some of the UN human rights treaties, but that's far away, and treaties and the human rights committees that deal with them don't have the same status, really, or legitimacy that regional human rights tribunals would have. I should also say that I'm committed to the notion that we should have regional international criminal courts. I don't think that the ICC is enough. Mm-hmm. And we see the problems that we have now in Africa, which I don't think is really the fault of the ICC, but I think it would help, and would have helped if we had some regional courts that would deal also with subjects that the ICC has no jurisdiction over. Drugs, for example, piracy, all kinds, trade in slavery, all of those topics could be dealt with and should be dealt with in regional international criminal courts. And regional international criminal courts would also play a very important role in helping and coordinating the work of the human rights courts. Because the human rights courts regional human rights courts only deal with governmental violations of human rights. They don't deal with the violations of the individuals who are really responsible for what the governments did. And that's where it would be extremely useful, because the ICC is just not going to be able to deal with all of those tremendous violations of human rights that are being committed. So I think it would be important. I don't think it would detract from the ICC, because the ICC can only deal with a very limited number most serious violations of human rights.
Well, let me just ask you a couple of questions around that. Let's stick with the regional human rights courts for a second first. In Latin America, the Inter-American Court is under some pressure or attack at the moment.
Which shows that they're doing a good job.
Yes, I suppose that's right. But there's a good bit of, and I think you've got an interesting analysis of that we'd like to hear. The European Court, I think, remains effective, but I don't think there's much of a movement, or we don't see much in Asia to give us hope immediately of a strong regional court. What do it'd be interesting to get your thoughts on how we move from here to there. First of all, why it's good that courts are getting pushed back. I think that's an interesting point of view. I think you've got some good reasons for it. But secondly, how do we move from a planet with a couple of strong regional human rights courts to more than that?
Well, we're beginning to have the ASEAN countries have a commission, a very weak system, but one has to push the idea. Mm-hmm. And I think would be more useful. This is where the UN can do it, push much harder, mm-hmm. Encourage it, and be. I think pushing is the only political pushing. Mm-hmm. I mean, the inter-American system, the truth is, the convention was ratified only when President Carter started sending around people to various countries to get them to ratify the American Convention. I mean, that's the reality. Much of Central America would never have ratified if his people hadn't gone around. And of course they signed because they thought this is just a lot of, nobody took it very seriously. Hypocrisy, incidentally, I've always felt is a wonderful thing that helps human rights. They all say, of course we don't violate human rights. We can sign anything. And they would sign things without making reservations. To think whether they should have made reservations because they thought it would never bite. And then suddenly it begins to bite. So governments have to push. What's happening in the Ukraine today, right. The reaction of the European Union and the United States, in a sense, contributed to, you saw the withdrawal of, it may be temporary only, but there has to be that same sort of pressure brought on various countries in Asia to say, you start drafting some human rights conventions, and then maybe you'll have an easier time dealing with those problems than with far away the UN Human Rights Committee, which really does not deal significantly with it. It's a very important institution, but it's not a court.
One of the points that I think is implicit in what you were saying, and I think you've said it before, that in some ways democracies react very differently to these courts than authoritarian governments.
Yeah.
I thought that was an interesting point, and the audience would be good for them to hear that. Essentially, that democracies say, "Oh, we're democracies. Wait a second, we're doing the right thing. We're respecting human rights." Whereas dictatorships take a bit different position.
Yeah. Well, what I found in Latin America, and you probably know that very well, when the dictators were in power in different countries, they were very concerned about being accused of violating human rights. I mean, they didn't do very much about it, but they always they were obedient to human rights institutions. The commission, they cooperated. Now, at least for a while, now countries, they consider themselves to be democratically elected. And that means that they know what human rights is all about, and it's no business of the international community to get into the act. So the Inter-American Commission, for example, today, has a lot of problems, mainly from so-called democratic countries. It never had those problems with the dictatorships, because the dictatorships were in many ways, they were concerned about their positions.
Right.
Whereas these countries say, we're elected, we can do anything we want to. Suddenly, intervention in domestic affairs begins to be something that these same leaders in the old days never thought of dealing with. So I think the human rights field is an fascinating field because one has to know how to play the piano. Dealing with different countries at different times.
Right.
There's no reason today why, just because you're democratically elected, you can't be violating human rights, and they do.
Strong point.
Including, incidentally, the United States. I don't know whether you saw the newspaper today.
Anything in particular?
Yes. I can't resist raising that issue. I don't know whether you saw in the newspaper today that Texas is just getting ready to execute somebody from a group of 51 or so Mexicans who were on death row.
Yes.
In various states in the United States. And the International Court of Justice, I was still on the court, decided that their rights under the Vienna Convention were violated. They had a right to access their consul, and they were never given the notice that they had that right. The International Court held that given the fact that they were denied that right, the United States had the legal obligation to ensure that all of these people on death row had a right to have their conviction reviewed to determine whether they were prejudiced by the failure to have been accorded those rights. Of course, Texas, for one thing, said that it wasn't bound by it wasn't a party to the Vienna Convention of the law, so it didn't have to comply with it. But what's happening today is that a person who was in that group and was never given the rehearing is going to be executed, presumably. The US Supreme Court held that this was an international obligation of the United States, but the Supreme Court lacked the power to do it without congressional legislation. This decision was, I think, the ICTJ rendered the decision in I think 2004 or 5. This Congress has not acted yet. And if Texas goes ahead and executes, it's a clear violation of the United States obligations. And not only that, here is a person executed who's never had a chance, a right which he had under international law, to have his conviction reviewed. And what's happening? Nothing. Now, if this were a dictatorship, imagine.
Right.
All the world would suddenly pay attention to it. Nobody pays any attention to it. It's
clear Tom was on the International Court of Justice. I think he makes this point with a lot of precision.
I was on the court at the time.
And
as an American,
it's a scandal, really.
As an American, to be sitting on this court, and I voted against the United States, which I thought on this case was only the proper thing to do. And then to find that my own country is in a position now where this person is going to be executed. And imagine if this were an American being executed someplace else.
Well, Tom, I was wondering if we might...
I'm sorry, I get...
No, you bring a lot of
Gets
passion
to me
the
after a
issue,
while.
And you make the point strongly, and I think we should send this tape to Rick Perry and try to get Texas moving in the right direction. I'm with you completely.
Good luck.
I thought we might move a little further south, though, to El Salvador and your experience and your time on the Truth Commission there. It was a UN-established commission. All three of you were appointed by the UN, and I would be really interested to hear your reflection on the commission. Of course, the commission somewhat controversially made the decision to name names, and then of course the government passed an amnesty. That is now, I think, before the Constitutional Court. So there's been a number of developments there, but I'd be really interested in what you think the long-term impacts of truth commissions are. El Salvador and beyond, we've had some 40 truth commissions at this stage in various parts of the world. a few of them established by the United Nations system, most of them, I think, arising out of national processes. But how do you see truth commissions play in this question of human rights, justice, and their long-term impact?
I've always thought that courts are very important, but so are truth commissions, particularly working together with courts. For example, I've often thought that Germany, Nuremberg wasn't enough. Courts cannot really tell a history of a terrible conflict. Truth commissions really can describe the history of what went on and the causes in a way that, if it is a good truth commission, in a way that courts cannot do. You have individual cases that you deal with. It would have helped Germany after the war, especially in the early days, to have had a impartial truth commission that could have looked at the situation in Germany and tried to analyze what were the causes, so that the generation that was involved in those activities would have gotten a view that they never got. Now, fortunately, now that generation is long gone, and you have a very different Germany today than you had then. But for example, in the Bosnian conflict, I think it would have helped. Next to the tribunal, even though I admit it's not easy to have a truth commission and have a court at the same time because of the difficult problems. A truth commission has to be able to get testimony, and that has to be coordinated somehow procedurally with how courts operate, and it's not an easy thing.
Sierra Leone was not an experiment that went so well, right?
Yes, but I think it can be done. But it would be extremely important, especially in smaller countries. In El Salvador, we were really able to, in a relatively short period of time, to sort of capture the causes and deal with the issues. The problem in El Salvador turned out to be today, it's really common crimes more than political issues. But truth commissions are very important. They don't take the place of courts, but I don't think courts take the place of truth commission either. And they're very important. I think in South Africa too, they played an important role. Even though individuals, you can criticize it because you feel these people got off. But getting criminals off is not necessarily a bad thing under certain circumstances. Mandela has proved it.
You had said something that you had written something along the lines that the most important role of a truth commission is to tell the truth. I think you said that, which you said sounds trite, but it's not. And I wondered you might expand on that a little bit. It seems pretty fundamental that they ought to be telling the truth, but a lot of truth commissions now have a lot of other responsibilities in a sense, or they're given mandates that cover all kind of different issues. So I'd be interested to hear what your thought was behind truth commissions telling the truth.
Well, when you sit on a truth commission, the thing that you worry the most about is that you're going to make a finding that turns out to be totally wrong. For example, you identified somebody, and we identify by name individuals responsible for certain terrible acts, and imagine, and then it turns out that the person wasn't there. It destroys your entire work. So we were unbelievably careful over and over and over to make sure that when we named somebody, that we knew for sure. And as a result, of course, some people that we weren't so sure about escaped being named, and that's of course part of what happened. I thought when we were criticized by some of these people, it was a wonderful criticism. I really enjoyed it. We were referred to as these arrogant foreigners. Now, I'd always like to be called an arrogant foreigner than somebody who lied. Right. We were the arrogant foreigners. None of these people argued that we were wrong. That's what I mean by
Right.
telling, but it means it's hard work. So it's not an easy, truth commissions aren't easy. We actually decided to name names. We didn't intend originally, but we found out just a short period before that the government was going to give amnesties.
Mm-hmm.
So instead of being able to recommend that they be tried, we thought, well, the least you can do, because the names were so important to the people whose loved ones were treated as traitors and killed in El Salvador, to at least be able to say, yes, it's not that I am telling you, my child, sister, but it's an international commission that says this man was the traitor and the criminal, not my husband, not my brother, not my sister. So it's a tremendously important institution for the next generations, probably much more so than courts. But I don't want to be misunderstood. I believe in courts.
I believe you. But that does bring me to the issue or question of education, because it's something you talk about a lot, the importance of education. And I think you're quite passionate about the importance of
I seem to be too passionate and about too many things. My wife is here, so I have to be careful.
I realize that. I'm going to tone this down quickly. But yeah, you talked a good bit about education, and of course Germany in some ways is an excellent example of how the curriculum changed in response to justice initiatives, to the Nuremberg trials, to the Frankfurt trials, to a generation in the 60s who said to their fathers, their grandfathers, where were you, and so forth. And I'm interested to hear your thoughts on, as an educator too, how you see the role of transitional justice, human rights, and education, and what we can do to advance that.
You know, I've always, the thing about when one talks about human rights education, it's not as sexy as talking about courts.
Now you're in trouble with your wife. So.
Yes. But you have to look at the history of Germany to see, you know, 60-some years ago, Germany was a killer nation. And today it's probably the most democratic country in Europe. Education. It took a long time. Some generations had to die. But that was achieved in Germany because of education. Careful, concentrated education. So it gives one faith that it is really possible through education to transform nations. But it means you really have to work at it. And the Germans worked at it in the way only Germans know how to work, systematically. And with some fascinating programs, they have established actually a whole federal institution, the Bundeszentrale für politische Bildung, a federal office for political education that helped teachers and others distributed material. Tremendous job over a long period of time. And it wasn't easy in the beginning. I know because I was in school in Germany after the war. Imagine, I come out of the camp and I go to school in Germany, and my teachers, some of those who were party members at some point or another, never touched the subject in history of the Holocaust or the Second World War. We were dealing with medieval history.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But today, it's unbelievable what's happening in Germany.
I recall, I think in the book, where, as you were saying, they were teaching about the Greeks and the Romans, and you went to your mother, and your mother then went to the headmaster, and I think the curriculum changed. So that's an advocacy in action, I suppose.
Well, my mother was very special. But
I know we're pretty much out of time. I wonder if I can ask you just one or two quick final questions. No, I'm out of time. You presaged it though, and maybe just a word or two. You mentioned, first you asked me about a lucky child, and I was going to preserve that for the last question. Then I decided Mandela would be the last question, and you mentioned Mandela. And Mandela has just passed from the scene, and I just wondered if you had any thoughts or reflections, because in many ways his struggle resembles your struggle a bit for human rights and for justice. And since we're, I think, on the verge of his funeral, if you had any thoughts about Mandela, and then we'll open it up for a few questions.
No, I mean, everything that needs to be said about this great man has already been said. But it shows really what can be done with the commitment to reconciliation after terrible conflicts. Germany is one example, South Africa another. And then you see countries that haven't figured it out yet, that still haven't done it. And it's hard to believe why some, and I don't need to mention them, that still haven't apologized for what they've done. And the failure to apologize just breeds more hatred, and it continues. Whereas if they simply said terrible things happened, it was a different generation, we apologize, we hope never to do it, and let's get together and be friends, and we don't. And then you've got problems in Asia today that could have been solved years and years ago. So I think Mandela taught all of us what reconciliation is all about.